Let's get started. So Thursday we're back out in the field. I'd like to put up a bat detector, and I'd like to get a song meter up if we can, and maybe swap out cards on those cameras and see what we have. For a lecture, what I want to do today is I want to talk about the evolution of mammals, and we've sort of addressed that a little bit already, talking about this whole notion of terrestrialization, and especially with regards to the skull. We've talked about it with respect to the jaw structure and whatnot, and those sorts of things. And we've also talked a little bit about this first issue that presents itself, and that is the fact that mammals are endothermic, and that's a problem because ectothermy is so insanely efficient. Being a snake or a lizard is just such a slam dunk way to get through life. If the purpose of life is to make copies of yourself, to reproduce, right, then reptiles do that in spades. And they do it with less energy than mammals. Mammals waste an awful lot of energy, and the fact that they're here and the fact that mammals are so successful means that somehow you have to try and understand that. What is it about endothermy that makes it possible for mammals to be so successful? It's an expensive way to get through life, and yet they're able to do it. All right, so the reptiles have this explosive adaptive radiation, right? They're ectothermic, and it isn't until the end of that, at the end of the Cretaceous, that the mammals really begin to have their own adaptive radiation. So the key is, how can we explain the emergence, right? What is it about mammals that enabled them to persist? And if you think about it, if you've ever had a pet snake, you feed your snake every other week, every third week, something like that. Regardless of how big it is, if it's a little tiny snake or a giant snake, you don't. I've had snakes in the lab that have gone 6 months between meals, and they've done just fine. You won't find a single mammal that's capable of doing that. Okay? So something we have to explain that. So for the most part, mammals are endothermic. There are a couple of exceptions. And there are, both with respect to mammals and reptiles, there are some reptiles that are endothermic. Sea turtles are endothermic. Indian pythons females are endothermic as long as they're incubating eggs. But most mammals are endothermic. Some of them aren't very good at it. The mammals that aren't very good at endothermy are the monotremes, so the duck-billed platypus and the echidna. 2- and 3-toed sloths aren't very good at endothermy. They do a pretty piss-poor job of it. Marsupials, in general, have lower body temperatures than placental mammals. Their body temperatures are down around 26, 27 degrees, right, compared to our 36 or 37 degrees. So they are sort of some kind of compromise, if you think about it. And then, of course, the other thing, the two attributes that define mammals are mammary glands and then the presence of fur. All mammals have fur. Even naked mole rats have fur. Even whales have fur, right? If you look at a whale, it has eyelashes. The heck do they have eyelashes for, right? They're in an aquatic environment, but they have eyelashes. So all mammals have fur of one flavor or another. And the thing about fur is that it enables you to form this boundary layer. And what that means is that here's your arm, right? And if you have fur on your arm, right, and the air is coming across like that, the hair slows down the air. So the air that's going right here below that is traveling a little bit slower, and the air right below that is traveling at a little bit slower as well. And there's friction here with the skin, so the air traveling right next to the skin is the slowest of all. So So the consequence of all of that is simply that the air that's close to the skin is more stationary than the air that's well above the surface. So who cares? Well, if that air is stationary, what that means is, in terms of the moisture content of the air, it's going to be closer to the moisture content of the skin. So if you have fur and you have a little bit of moisture on the skin, and that air is moving slowly, that means the air right above the skin is going to be very humid, whereas the air way up here might be very dry. So it's going to slow down the rate of evaporation of that moisture. So it's one way the mammal can preserve moisture. The other thing is, the air that's right next to the skin is going to be roughly the same temperature as the skin. And as you get farther away from the skin, the air is going to get either colder or hotter. So the air is serving as an insulation layer too. So insulation is a big part of what fur is all about. And that makes sense if you're a mammal and you have this high body temperature, high temperature compared to the environment, right? Somehow you'd like to preserve as much of that heat as you can. The more heat you lose, the more calories you have to take in. So the presence of hair is this really cool thing. Of course, we've already talked about the problems associated with hair and endothermy. The question is, which came first? Did the fur come first, or did the endothermy come first? We talked about George Bartholomew's experiments with the little desert iguanas wearing the peromyscus fur coats, did we not? Yeah, we talked about that, right? So which came first, it's not at all clear, right? It's sort of ambiguous. It's hard to understand. You know they didn't happen at the same time. That's an extremely low probability event. So that's something we have to figure out. And of course, the other thing is that mammals nurse their youngs, which is expensive. Okay? Think about the energetic cost of lactation. It is enormous. All you have to do to understand the energetic cost of lactation is look at human females that give birth and divide your human female brand new mothers into two groups. Those that are going to bottle feed their babies, so they're going to feed their babies with formula, and those that are going to breastfeed their babies for the first year. And all women generally put on a fair bit of weight during pregnancy, right? There are all sorts of physiological reasons for that. Which group is going to lose that weight first? And it's the women that are nursing their young that lose that weight first. They drop an enormous amount of weight as a consequence of lactation. It used to be a hot topic in comparative physiology to estimate what the energetic cost of lactation was, and people would do it for peromyscus and elephants and rhinos and giraffes and mice and dogs and cats and all that. And it turns out that it increases the energetic cost quite dramatically. So your daily caloric intake necessary when you're nursing is quite a bit higher than when you're not nursing. So it is energetically expensive, which is interesting because it brings up another important point. By nursing your young, the cost of reproduction is basically shifting over to the female. So if you're a fish, and all you do is pop out some eggs, and your eggs are bigger than the sperm, but still the total caloric content is not that great. Reproduction is relatively inexpensive. By the time you get to a mammal, the energetic cost of reproduction is huge, and most of that cost is carried by the female. And that has certain implications for the mating systems that mammals use. Because most of the mating systems in mammals are therefore designed to increase the contribution on the part of the male. And that's why, for example, in humans, you see these long-lasting pair bonds, and you see a legal structure which is designed basically to protect the female and her offspring. It's there for a reason, okay? All right, so if you think about a reptile, and we may have already looked at this, this illustration once before, but it's pretty clear the advantages of being a reptile. The sources of heat gained by the reptile can be direct solar radiation, it can be reflected solar radiation, it can be conduction, and it can be convection. And of course you can flip all of that around and lose heat in essentially the same way, but it's relatively straightforward. Now, when you talk about mammals, what is it that defines a mammal? Well, tits and fur, fine, but you don't see those two things when you're looking in the fossil record. So what is it that defines a mammal? Well, the first thing is the synapsid skull, rather than the diapsid skull that you see in birds and reptiles. All right, so it's that one temporal opening, and you have to make sure you understand the difference between the synapsid and the euryapsid, because the euryapsids had only a single temporal opening as well. Perhaps most important of all, mammals have but a single bone in the lower jaw. That is the dentary bone. What happens to the quadrate and the articular? They migrate up into the inner ear and become the malleus and the incus. Okay? So mammals have 3 inner ear ossicles, and they have only one bone in the lower jaw. All right, so the question is, what attributes might have produced the mammals, or what selective pressures might have produced the mammals? Well, we already know that there was this group of reptiles back before the end of the Permian, the therapsid reptiles, right? So see the connection? Therapsid reptiles, right? And the mammals are referred to as the prototherians or the eutherians, okay? So the prototherian mammals, and then the therian mammals, the metatherian mammals, and then the eutherian mammals. The eutherian mammals are the placental mammals, the metatherian mammals are the marsupials, and the prototherian mammals are the monotremes and platypuses, okay? So the therapsids, the ther, T-H-E-R, refers to mammal, okay? So the therapsids show up before the end of the Permian, and we already know, based on their sails, right, and their skull designs, that they were very mammal-like, and they were perhaps geared towards thermoregulatory strategies. Okay? All right, so there's this mass extinction at the end of the Permian. 95% of all species go extinct, right? Why is that? What caused that mass extinction event at the end of the Permian? Because that's basically when the mammal radiation begins, although at a very low level until the end of the Cretaceous. So here we are, time. This is number of species. And here we have the Permian, whammo bammo, 95% of all species are gone, just like that. And from that comes the age of reptiles. And then whammo bammo, we have another mass extinction event where we lose roughly 50% of all species. So that point right there, that's the therapsid reptiles show up there. Some of them make it through that mass extinction event, and it's from that group that the mammals evolved. So mammals, in a very real way, have their origin way the heck back there. They're moving along at a very low level until the end of the Cretaceous, at which point they have their adaptive radiation event. So, what causes that mass extinction event? That's the mass extinction event that wiped out the first radiation of the amphibians. Why? Well, think about what was the vegetation like then?
Was it wet?
It would have, well, yeah, some places were wet. What causes that geologically? What is happening on the surface of the Earth at the end of the Permian?
Isn't it heating up or something like that?
Pardon?
Heating up?
Well, the climate is changing, yeah. Average temperatures probably aren't, but the climate is changing. In what positions are all of the continents prior to this point right here?
Pangea.
Not yet. Prior to that mass extinction, all the continents are separate. Okay? Why is that important? Because this is when Pangea forms. That mass extinction event is caused by the formation of Pangea. So the end Permian mass extinction is caused by the formation of Pangea, not by the breakup of Pangea. We always talk about this mass extinction, the end Cretaceous mass extinction event, as being caused by this asteroid hitting the planet Earth, right? But in fact, that mass extinction event was going on for quite some time. It wasn't sudden, it was a gradual mass extinction event. What caused that? The breakup of Pangea. So that mass extinction event is caused, the end Permian mass extinction event is caused by the formation of Pangea. The end Cretaceous mass extinction is initiated by the breakup of Pangea. Why? Why to both of those? All right. We've talked a lot about surface area to volume ratios. Let's think about the same sort of idea of ratios, but instead think back to your calculus class that you had way back when. When you had calculus way back when, very early on, you were given this problem. How do you optimize something? So you want to maximize the amount of area you can enclose with the fence. What should the shape of the area be? A square, a rectangle, an ellipse, a circle. Remember that problem from introductory calculus? Okay. So you want a certain amount of perimeter for area. So I guess the question I'm asking is, how are you going to increase or decrease the ratio between edge and area? Think about it from continents. If you have all your continents squeezed together into one giant continent versus breaking the continents apart, in this one, you have the same amount of area as you do when they're all broken apart. The area is the same. But how's about the perimeter? Which one has more perimeter relative to area? Yeah. When they're all broken up, that's when they have more perimeter compared to area. Great. Why is that important?
There's more shoreline.
More shoreline. Where do amphibians come from? The water. Okay? Where do you have more water? In this or in this? Over here. So just as a stochastic process, the likelihood that amphibians show up is greater here than it is here. Now think about the climate. Have you ever lived close to the ocean? If you've ever lived close to the ocean, if you live in Southern California and it's December 24th, what will you be wearing? Shorts and a t-shirt. You live in Missouri, December 24th, what are you going to be wearing? Long pants, a hoodie, a warm jacket, mittens, your face mask, okay? You're going to be all bundled up. What's the difference? In California, you're right next to the water. Here, you're far away from the water. It's hard to change the temperature of water. As a consequence, the temperature on those small islands is relatively moderate. It's even. It doesn't change a lot, which is easy for an amphibian to tolerate. Once it looks like this, it's all over. Because now the interior of that continent could become very hot in the summer and very cold in the winter and very dry. This is going to be inhospitable to amphibians. That is very hospitable to amphibians. So that causes that. Now flip it around. Now you have the evolution of the dinosaurs, all these giants. And now all of the continents, they've been separated, right? You've had this, and now this giant continent is beginning to break up. So here you have the dinos, and now it's breaking up into these smaller parcels. Why is that bad for the dinosaurs? The dinosaurs were big. Big animals have small populations. Small populations suffer from what? Inbreeding, lack of genetic diversity. With a lack of genetic diversity, is it easier or harder to adapt to changes? Harder, because there's no genetic variation. And it's that inability, when the giant supercontinent breaks up, population sizes are now small, loss of genetic variation, inability to adapt, and consequent extinction over a relatively long period of time. Okay? And it's in that scenario where the mammals take off. All right. So there are two major lineages of mammals. There are the Prototherian mammals and the Therian mammals. Okay? So the Prototherian mammals are the monotremes, and today we have what? 3 species of monotremes. We have 2 species of echidnas, and we have the duck-billed platypus. When the first duck-billed platypus was collected in Australia, it was brought back to the British Museum, and they refused to accept it. Why? What was going on at that time? What was it like in the world of science back in the early 1800s? So Darwin has not published yet The Origin of Species. There are lots of different hypotheses about evolution and so on. What are some of the hoaxes you're familiar with regards to?
Spontaneous generation.
Yeah, spontaneous. People thought spontaneous generation. Are you guys familiar with the whole initial stories about where people come from? Scientifically, the scientific explanations? So, I mean, before we had microscopes, before you could really look at stuff, I mean, people knew that men produce sperm, right? But they did not know that women produced eggs. So they were smart enough to know that when they had sex, right, that the sperm were introduced into the female. But the idea was that inside each sperm was a new, perfectly developed, small human being. And all the woman did was provide this nice nurturing environment where this small human being could grow and develop. But the contribution of the female was nothing more than providing a nice, safe place for development. There was no clue that she had anything at all to do genetically or in any other way with the development of this offspring. Okay? So we didn't have the cell concept yet. When fossils were first discovered, people were outraged. Why? Why did they not believe in the whole concept of fossils? Yeah, what about the Bible?
Well, like fossils make the earth older than what it was believed to be.
Well, so according to the Bible, Genesis, on day 1 this happens, day 2, day 7 God takes a break, right? Is there any mention in the Bible about dinosaurs?
No.
Pterodactyls, pteranodon, any of that sort of nothing. What are the animals that are described in the Bible? Pardon? Mammals that are present in the Middle East. There's no description of mammals that are strictly in the New World. There's no mention of sloths. There's no mention of kangaroos. There's no mention of anything other than what shows up in the Middle East. In other words, the writers of the Bible thought, right, that everything that is there in the Middle East, that's all there is. So now you find fossils, and you find obvious remains from animals that clearly are not like the animals in the Middle East. They're not described in Genesis. That's a problem, right? Because what does it indicate? What does it tell you about the Bible?
It's wrong.
Not necessarily that it's wrong, but what is it? It's incomplete. Okay? In other words, the Bible does not present the literal truth. There's more to the story. Okay? So that's the first problem. The second problem is, clearly, by now, we've been all over the world. Right in the 1800s, we've seen everything. And now you realize there are lots of animals that don't show up in the Bible, and we know that whales aren't fish, but whales are mammals by this time. Okay? And now you see dinosaurs, or fossils for dinosaurs, and you're going, whoa, wait a minute. Now you have a second problem, because the implication of the Bible is that the earth is static, that it doesn't change. And suddenly you're looking at the fossil record and realizing, holy shit, it sure as heck does change. So the fossils become controversial. So, in the 1800s, there were people that would discover fossils of stars. And they would bring all of these fossils into museums, right? Museums are, right, you know, fossils are being discovered and they're all excited. Fossils of, in other words, there were all these efforts to show that the whole concept of the fossil record was ridiculous and wrong. In fact, there were fossils designed to show the evolution of man, which were clearly fakes. Right? People would make these phony fossils and present them as real. It was all designed to confuse and to show how ridiculous the whole concept of the fossil record really was. Well, we have a couple of other problems with regards to the Prototherian mammals, the monotremes, right? The first ones that show up, the first duck-billed platypus that shows up at the British Museum, they've just been through all this controversy about these fake fossils and whatnot. And here's this thing that shows up, and it has feet that look like duck feet, and it has a bill that looks like a duck bill, and it doesn't have any teeth. And if you're the curator at the British Museum, you're going, oh, wait a minute, somebody is jacking me around. Somebody has got this big-ass duck, and they've done a really good job on the taxidermy, and they've sewn this duck bill and these duck legs onto some kind of a mammal. They're faking us out. And then later on, when they discovered that duck-billed platypuses lay eggs, they're going, oh yeah, it's all a fake. So nobody believed that these things were real. It wasn't until much later that people began to understand what duck-billed platypuses really were. So here's the cool thing. Duck-billed platypuses and echidnas, the two species of echidnas, are very reptile-like. They both lay eggs. We say mammals have tits and fur. Duck-billed platypuses have fur. but they don't have nipples. But they do nurse their young. How do you nurse your young if you don't have nipples? There's a puzzle for you. Well, let's think about that for just a moment. What are nipples? We've all got a pair. Some of us have more. For half of us they work, for the other half they don't. What are nipples? Come on, don't give me this shit. Don't try and tell me you've never wondered what the heck they are. You've never thought about it. If you're a guy, you spend significant portions of every day thinking about them. Okay? What the heck are they? Histologically, biologically, what is a nipple? It's a what?
It's a thin layer of skin running on.
It's a gland.
It's a gland. It's a sebaceous gland. Do you have any other sebaceous glands?
Oh, yeah.
Oh yeah, your whole body is covered with sebaceous glands. All of your sweat glands are sebaceous glands. So what is a nipple? A concentration of sweat glands. That's all. In this one area, you've taken all these sweat glands, put them all into the same place. That's a nipple. When you're nursing babies, all you're doing is sweating profusely through those glands. And it turns out it's pretty cool because in those particular sweat glands, there's an awful lot of fat and there's an awful lot of protein. All the stuff that baby needs. Okay? So now, you look at the belly, you look at the ventrum of a duck-billed platypus or an echidna, there are no nipples, but there are sebaceous glands. And when these animals have given birth, when they've laid their eggs and the eggs have hatched, they start sweating profusely on the ventrum. And the little babies come along and lick up the sweat. That's how they're fed. All they do is they lick up the sweat off the belly of the female. So, nipples work great as long as you've got lips. If you've got lips, you can suck. If you don't have lips, you can't suck. If you can't suck, the nipple doesn't do you any good. Do duck-billed platypuses and echidnas have lips? They don't. They can't suck. They're the only mammals that don't suck. Well, that's not true. Whales don't suck either. But they don't have the ability to suck. Because they can't suck, they can make it though because they can't lick. All they have to do is lap up the sweat off the ventrum of the female. So duck-billed platypuses and echidnas have sweat glands and extremely dense fur. In fact, the fur on a duck-billed platypus, if you ever get the opportunity, if you're ever in a museum or some sort of display, you'll have to go to Australia to do it, but if you ever go to one, or you ever go to a petting zoo in Australia where they've got a duck-billed platypus, they charge you $100 to run your fingers through the fur of a duck-billed platypus. It's worth every penny. Okay? Just get that thing and just run your fingers through the fur on that duck-billed platypus. You think a chinchilla coat is awesome? It sucks. You think a mink coat is awesome? It sucks. By comparison to that duck-billed platypus fur. It is so thick and so luxurious and so awesome, it's better than sex. You start doing, you can't stop yourself. They can't drag you away. It just, the fun never ends. All you want to do is run your fingers through that fur. It is that awesome. Okay? I know because when I was at Cal State Fullerton, we had a bunch of duck-billed platypuses in the collection. And I worked in the museum every night from midnight until 8 o'clock in the morning. And I always take about a half-hour break, pull out the tray that had the duck-billed platypuses in it, and just do that. It was great. It was so awesome. Why do they have that thick fur? Ductile platypuses have low body temperatures. Their body temperature is about 24 degrees. Yours is 37. Marsupials is about 27. So they have a very low body temperature. Where do ductile platypuses live? What kind of habitat do they live in?
Are they like somewhat aquatic?
They're aquatic. They live in cold streams. The entrances to their dens are below water. So they're living in these dens, and in order to feed, they go down into the water, and the water is cold. And as soon as they get into the water, their body temperature starts to drop. So the amount of time they spend feeding is determined by how much time they spend feeding is determined by how long they can keep their body above a certain critical thermal minimum. Okay? All right. So the thick fur extends the period that they can feed in the water. Well, they don't have teeth, which means for most mammals, the way we know about most mammals on the planet is based on their teeth. These guys don't have teeth. Their girdles are different though. Their pectoral girdles are very reptile-like. So they have all of these reptilian attributes, and they have a few mammalian attributes. The interesting thing about the fact that they don't have teeth is when you find one in the fossil record, you don't know, is it a mammal or is it a reptile? Because the skulls are kind of reptile-like. Okay? If you go to Australia and you talk to Australian biologists about fossil marsupials and whatnot, they're not very happy about it because the oldest marsupial fossils are in what continent? North America. Marsupials evolved here. Where are the oldest monotremes fossils? It's hard because we really don't know what a monotreme looks like. But it looks like the oldest monotreme fossils might be in South America. Okay? In other words, the people in Australia can't even lay claim to the fact that they are where marsupials and monotremes evolved. All right. So the question becomes then, what does the phylogeny for marsupials and all the other mammals look like? There are two possible hypotheses. One is that the mammals are polyphyletic, and the other is that they are monophyletic. The monophyletic argument argues that in the evolution of mammals, you split into two clades, the prototherians over here, the ductile platypuses, right, and the echidnas over here, and the therian mammals over here, which then divide into the kangaroos and all of those guys, and the placental mammals over here. Versus the idea that the prototherians have always been separate and uniquely distinct from everybody else. Which hypothesis is correct? I think most people would argue this, right? But there are all sorts of reasons for arguing this hypothesis, because these guys really are still very reptile-like. My apologies. All right. All right, so which of those is correct? It's probably a monophyletic origin, right? But there are a lot of people that would argue for a polyphyletic origin, okay? So, the earliest mammals have a couple of interesting attributes. That is, they are relatively small, but the most important thing about the earliest mammals that we know of, right? We don't know anything about the monotremes. The earliest thing about the mammals is their teeth. and they go through these rather bizarre sorts of changes in their teeth. And the nice thing about that is teeth are easy to find in the fossil record. 95% of all mammal fossils consist of nothing more than a single tooth. So the first mammals are relatively small. And amongst those earliest mammals, there's a group that is referred to as the Triconodonts. Three, cones. So the three-coned teeth. Notice that's different from the typical reptile tooth. The typical reptile tooth is but a single cone. So these earliest mammals have three-coned teeth. Then, in pretty rapid order, you find these things called the Docodont teeth. And those teeth are much more complex. It's no longer the kind of dentition that you see in reptiles, just a single cone, right? The teeth are very rapidly becoming more complex. In fact, you get these mammals called the multituberculates, because if you look at the surface of the teeth, you see there are all these different tubercles on the surface. That provides a surface similar to what you see in a cow or a horse, something like that. In other words, a tooth that looks like that is capable of grinding. So if you're eating vegetation, you can grind away at the cellulose and get at all the good stuff that is on the inside. Reptiles never made that accomplishment. So the earliest mammals are relatively small. Uh-oh. Why is that a problem? What's the problem with being small if you're a mammal?
You have to eat a lot.
You have to eat a lot. Okay? So the energetic requirements are going to be high. And as the energetic requirements are high, you better be damn efficient at getting food. And you see that in the evolution of their teeth. Here is a multituberculate. So this is not a modern mammal. What the heck is up with those? There are a couple of things going on here. That's a premolar right there. So the molar teeth in the back, the premolar in the front. What is the shape of that tooth? That tooth is shaped like a cone. Have you ever seen a cone-shaped tooth on an animal before? Well, colugos have cone-shaped teeth. The lower incisors on a colugo look exactly like that. And what the colugo does is it uses that cone to scrape away at the waxy cuticle on the surface of a leaf so that it can get at what's underneath. And presumably, this animal is doing the same thing. Notice in the back, the teeth are geared towards grinding. Notice at the front, the teeth are these sort of stabbing kinds of teeth. Notice as well that suture. Why is that suture important? It's kind of an interesting architecture for the front. So if you think about it, look at this lower jaw and look at that lower incisor tooth. The root for that tooth arcs around like this. So the amount of surface area that's used to anchor that tooth is large. You can imagine that this animal can apply a considerable amount of force on that tooth. Now consider those teeth up there, the upper incisors. How much force can those things tolerate? What happens if you apply too much force to these two teeth? Where's the weak spot? The weak spot is that suture right there. Okay? If this animal applies too much force there, that premaxilla is going to snap right off and he's lost the front of his face. Okay? So what does that tell you about the feeding ecology of this animal? It was probably using those lower incisors pretty aggressively, but not doing a whole lot with the upper incisors. If you look at the skull of a rodent or a lagomorph, what's the shape of that suture? It's not like that. If you look at a rodent or a beaver, that suture comes up like this and then bends back and extends all the way back here. In other words, the length of that suture is about 3 times longer in a rodent or a lagomorph than it is in these guys. And think about a beaver. How much force does a beaver apply with those upper incisors? A lot. All right. So then we get to modern mammals. And modern mammals have a kind of tooth design called the trigosphenic tooth. You have this nice little triangle on the surface of the tooth. And both the upper and lower teeth look exactly like that. So we're talking about the cheek teeth, the premolars and the molars. And if you look at the lower teeth, it also has that triangular shape, but it also has a heel on the tooth. So this heel right here is going to articulate with a tooth that's right up above it. So the whole success of mammals comes down to architecture of the teeth. They elevated their body temperature, they have fur to conserve energy. Because they have a high metabolic rate, they have to be able to feed very efficiently, take in a lot of calories. And the way they do that is by modifying the teeth. So the whole evolutionary history of mammals can be defined on the basis of teeth. All right. So let's go back now and think just very quickly about the origin of monotremes, marsupials, and the rest of the mammals. So let's go back. Pangea has formed. So we've seen the extinction of the first amphibian radiation. We have the formation of Pangea. The mammals show up. The earliest mammals evolved in North America. And those mammals have an adaptive radiation that takes them through South America, into Antarctica, and into Australia. The continents break up because now we're in the Cretaceous and the continents are beginning to break up, and now the monotremes and the marsupials are isolated in Antarctica and Australia. And it is after the monotremes and the marsupials have evolved that the other mammals evolved, the eutherian mammals evolved. So now the eutherian mammals evolved where? In either North America or Eurasia. And those mammals now radiate out to the rest of the world. But the marsupials are isolated. So why is it that in Australia, New Zealand, all you have is marsupial? Well, that's not true. You do have eutherian mammals in Australia. What are they? Bats that got there by flying, mice that got there on ships with people, okay? And there are some eutherian mammals that got across Wallace's line, rats and mice, that got across Wallace's line from Borneo, Suriname, and those places. But essentially, everything else in Tasmania, New Zealand, New Guinea, Australia is all marsupial. Okay? All right. We're going to stop there. I think I've exhausted my time. And we'll continue a little bit more on the origin of mammals next week. So Thursday, be prepared to go outdoors again. We'll meet at the same place. Okay? So if anybody needs a ride, let me know. We'll grab a SEMO van and we'll drive out there.